Hey there, history buffs! Welcome back to another exciting journey through the annals of time. Ever heard the one about Napoleon Bonaparte being really short, like comically short? It's one of those tales that seems to have stuck around forever. It's a story that's been told and retold for centuries, often with a healthy dose of British humour thrown in. The British, Napoleon's arch-enemies, love to poke fun at him. But what if I told you that Napoleon wasn't actually that short at all? Surprising, right? In fact, the whole short Napoleon thing is a big, fat historical myth. It's time to set the record straight and dive into the facts. This essay is here to set the record straight. We're going to explore the origins of this myth and why it has persisted for so long. We're diving deep into the life and times of one of history's most fascinating figures to uncover the truth about his height and how this misconception came to be. Buckle up, because we're about to debunk a myth. So how did this myth start? Well, it all began with a mix-up in measurements. You see, Napoleon's height was recorded in French inches, which are different from British inches. When converted, Napoleon's height of 5 feet 2 inches in French measurements actually translates to about 5 feet 6 inches in British measurements. Not so short after all, right? In fact, Napoleon was of average height for a Frenchman at this time. The myth likely gained traction because of British propaganda, which aimed to belittle their formidable foe. British newspapers and cartoons often depicted Napoleon as a tiny, angry man to mock him and undermine his authority. These exaggerated depictions stuck in the public's mind. Modern historians have debunked this myth time and again, but it remains one of the most persistent misconceptions in history. It's a fascinating example of how propaganda can shape our understanding of historical figures. So next time you hear someone joke about Napoleon's height, you'll know the real story. He wasn't short, he was just the victim of one of history's most effective smear campaigns. Thanks for joining us on this myth-busting adventure. Stay tuned for more historical truth revealed. Until next time, keep questioning and keep exploring. So, how did this whole short Napoleon thing combines a bit of truth with a hefty dose of exaggeration and clever propaganda? Well, like many good myths, it all began with a little bit of truth and a whole lot of exaggeration. The story of Napoleon's height is a perfect example of how facts can be twisted and turned into something entirely different. You see, he was a man of average stature for his time, but the perception of his height has been greatly distorted over the years. He was probably around 5'6" or 5'7" tall, which or even a bit on the shorter side. However, in the early 19th century, this was quite normal. But here's the catch: in early 19th century France, that was actually... People were generally shorter back then, so Napoleon's height wouldn't have stood out as particularly short. However, Napoleon's enemies, particularly the British, saw a golden opportunity to use of propaganda and knew that portraying him as diminutive could undermine his authority and make him a figure of ridicule. British cartoonists of the time went to town depicting Napoleon, constantly overshadowed by his taller, more imposing. Exaggerated depictions were incredibly effective in shaping public perception. The British press played a significant role in spreading these images far and wide. Newspapers and pamphlets were filled with comically small. This was a deliberate effort to belittle him in the eyes of the public. The impact of this propaganda was profound. People began to believe that Napoleon was much. The image of the Petite emperor became ingrained in popular culture, and it has persisted to this day. Historians have since debunked the myth, but the legend of Napoleon's height remains a fascinating example of how propaganda can shape history. It's a reminder that the stories we hear are often influenced by those who tell them. So next time, short, remember the power of propaganda and how it can turn a simple fact into a lasting myth. Now, let's talk numbers. Numbers have a way of revealing the truth, especially when it comes to historical figures whose legends have often overshadowed the facts. Historical records indicate that Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 pieds 2 pouces in French units of measurement. This system, used in France before the metric system was adopted, can be a bit confusing to modern readers. That translates to about 5 feet 6 inches in modern units. To put this into perspective, let's consider the conversion process. The French pied was slightly longer than the English foot, and the paus was roughly equivalent to an inch. So when we convert Napoleon's recorded height, we get a clearer picture. While this might seem a tad short by today's standards, it's important to remember that the average height for men in France during Napoleon's time was actually shorter than it is now. The average Frenchman in the late 18th and early 19th centuries stood at about 5 feet 5 inches. In fact, 5'6" would have placed Napoleon right around the average height for a Frenchman of his era. This means that, contrary to popular belief, Napoleon was not unusually short. He was in fact quite typical for his time. So, he wasn't towering over everyone, but he certainly wasn't the diminutive figure that history has often painted him to be. The myth of Napoleon's short stature likely arose from a combination of factors, including British propaganda and the difference in measurement systems. Understanding these nuances helps us see Napoleon in a more accurate light as a man who was very much a product of his time, both in stature and in influence. Napoleon's height, much like his legacy, has been subject to interpretation and exaggeration. By examining the historical records and understanding the context of the era, we can measure up to the truth and dispel the myths that have persisted for centuries. Despite not being exceptionally tall, Napoleon was known for his commanding presence and his ability to inspire those around him. He possessed a natural charisma and an aura of authority that often made him seem larger than life. His soldiers admired his courage, his strategic brilliance, and his unwavering determination. In their eyes, he was a giant among men, regardless of his actual height. This just goes to show that true leadership isn't measured in inches or centimeters, but in the impact one has on the world. Adding to the confusion surrounding Napoleon's height is the fact that the French paus, inch, was slightly longer than the British inch. So when his height was translated into English units, it was often rounded down, making him appear even shorter than he actually was. This discrepancy in measurement further fueled the myth of the little corporal and cemented his image as a short man in the minds of many. It's also worth noting that Napoleon surrounded himself with a particularly tall personal guard. These imposing figures, chosen for their stature and military prowess, often stood a head taller than the average Frenchman. This created a visual contrast that may have inadvertently contributed to the perception of Napoleon as being shorter than he actually was. When standing next to these giants, even a man of average height might appear small. But Napoleon's story is about so much more than just his height. He was a brilliant military strategist, a shrewd politician, and a complex, often contradictory figure who left an indelible mark on history. He rose from humble beginnings to become the Emperor of France, conquering vast swathes of Europe and implementing lasting reforms in law, education, and government. His story is a testament to the fact that greatness can come in any size. Section 8. Little man syndrome? Hardly. The myth of Napoleon's shortness has often been linked to the psychological concept of the Napoleon complex, which suggests that short men tend to overcompensate for their lack of height with aggression and domineering behavior. However, there is no evidence to suggest that Napoleon himself exhibited these traits. In fact, many historians believe that his ambitious nature and drive for power stemmed from his upbringing, his education, and the tumultuous political climate of his time, rather than any insecurities about his height. Section 9. The power of perspective. The persistence of the short Napoleon myth, even in the face of historical evidence to the contrary, speaks volumes about the power of perception, propaganda, and the enduring nature of a good story. It reminds us to be critical thinkers, to question what we think we know, and to always seek out the truth, even when it comes to something as seemingly trivial as a person's height. Section 10. Debunking the myth, a giant among men. So there you have it. Napoleon Bonaparte, the legendary French emperor, was not actually that short. He was a man of average height for his time, whose reputation for being diminutive is largely a product of British propaganda and historical misinterpretations. The next time you hear someone crack a joke about Napoleon's height, you can set them straight and share the truth about this fascinating historical figure. Section 11. Conclusion. standing tall in history. In the annals of history, Napoleon Bonaparte stands as a towering figure, not because of his physical stature, but because of his lasting impact on the world. He was a military genius, a political innovator, and a complex, often contradictory figure who continues to fascinate and inspire us today. His story reminds us that true greatness is not measured in inches or centimeters, but in the courage, determination, and vision to leave an enduring mark on the world.